Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chel Gimel, and Mir Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today near the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Beis with a brand new Siman Shin Beis. Dine Nikoi V'Kipol HaBegadim B'Shabbos, the halachas that govern the cleaning and the folding of garments on Shabbos. Uba Yud Gimel Seifim. And here we have 13 seifim. Our learning today should be a schus for Achedu Beis Yisrael Hanusunim Batzara Ba'Shivya Ha'im Dem Bein Ba'Yom Bein Ba'Abasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'Afelu La'Ira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Ba'Golo V'Zman Kariv V'Namar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Fu Shalema for Rachel Shava Basit L'Fredo Meshamer Ben Esther Fradl Tzvi Ben Miriam Chava Das Bas Rezel Serol Dvar Bas Shoshabina Rivka Bas Shira Leah and Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha. Our learning should also be a schus. The Rebbe Shalom should protect and watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol makom shehem. Okay, so let's embark here on a new Siman Shin Beis. Primarily today, we're going to be discussing cases that could potentially involve two different malachas on Shabbos. One is the malacha of melabein or kibus, and that is laundering garments. The other one is schita. Now, schita, squeezing out the liquid from a garment, that could be part of libun, of cleaning a garment. It could also be a tolada of dosh, of threshing. When you thresh grain, you remove the kernel of grain from the chaff that it is surrounded in. So too, when you extract water from a beged, you're extracting the water from the garment that it is absorbed in. Now, the Mechaber is going to be discussing a case when a person has a garment that is wet. And now you take that wet garment and you shake it out. And what we're going to see is that this could touch upon libun, upon cleaning. It also could touch upon schita. So let's see the Mechaber here in Sif Aleph. Hamina'er talis chadasha shechoira min hatal she'aleha. If somebody shakes out a black new garment, okay? So the Mechaber is very specific over here. We're talking about a talis. Now, when we say talis, we're not talking about like a davening talis. The word talis over here is a reference to any kind of beged. So the Mechaber is very specific. Kaminar talis chadasha. You're shaking out a new garment, not an old garment. And shchayra. It's a black garment. And what is it wet from? Men hatal she'aleha. It's wet from some dew. So it has droplets of dew that are on the beged. This is not a beged that's soaking wet. This is a black, new garment that has some moisture from some dew on it. Chayiv, this would be an Isser Daraisa, says the Mechaber. Now, the Mechaber kind of explains why it's an Isser Daraisa and qualifies this a little bit. Says the Mechaber, what's the problem over here? Sha'anir yafela k'moy kibus. Because when you're dealing with a black new garment, shaking it out is yafela. It is good for the beged. It accomplishes with this beged k'moy kibus. What laundering would accomplish. So what does the Mechaber seem to be saying over here? So again, the Mechaber is talking about a black new garment. So it's a very fresh garment. And it's black. Now, when you have a black garment, anything that's on it, a nice, crisp, fresh, black garment, anything that's on that garment is going to show up. So says the Mechaber, if you have a black, fresh garment that has droplets of dew on it, and you shake it out, you're going to be accomplishing something like kibus. Shanir yafel kamay kibus. And then the Mechaber says, V'hu, another qualifier over here, shemakpid aleha, this is only true if you are makpid, shaloy lelavshay b'loy nir. So the Mechaber, in this line and a half, said a real mouthful over here. So we're talking about, again, somebody has a garment and it is wet, but what is it wet from? It only has like droplets of dew on it. Now he wants to take it, and he wants to shake it out. Says the Mechaber, if you're dealing with a black garment, so that the droplets of dew really show up on it, and any other type of dirt or anything that's on it is really going to show up, and it's a new garment, so it's nice and crisp and fresh, and you are makpid, you're very fussy. You look at the garment the way it is, and you wouldn't wear it the way it is. So now you take it and you shake it out. Now you're over in Issa Daraisa of Kibbutz. Chayiv. Chayiv, we know, means that if you did it b'shoigig, you would be chayiv karban chatos. If it's chas v'sholom, you did it b'mezid, this would be a chayiv misa, b'chil Shabbos. Right? So this is mamish in Issa Daraisa. Now, there's a lot here that has to be explained. Let's go kind of like basics. If you launder a garment on Shabbos, I don't care what color it is. I don't care if it's new or if it's old. And I don't care if you're particularly fussy or you're not particularly fussy. In other words, if you happen to be a bit of a slobby fellow and you don't care if you go out wearing dirty clothing and you have an old white shirt, so it's not black, it's white, it's not new, it's old, and you're not fussy, you don't mind going out with a dirty shirt, and you take it and you wash it on Shabbos, guess what? That's an Issa Daraisa. So clearly, if we're talking about something which is really an act of kibbutz, if we're talking about laundering a garment, we wouldn't have all of these qualifiers. We don't have any of these qualifiers. If you launder a garment on Shabbos, that's an Issa Daraisa. I don't care who, I don't care why, all not negeya, I don't care what color it is, I don't care how old it is. You launder a garment on Shabbos, it's an Issa Daraisa, you're chayiv. So why do we have all of these qualifiers over here? So the truth is that the answer to this question is a little bit complex. You notice that there is a very lengthy biur halacha over here. It feels to me very much from the Mishnah Berurah that the Chavetz Chaim was walking a little bit of a tightrope when he wrote the Mishnah Berurah over here between different opinions and different ways of looking at this Gemara. The truth is that this Gemara is based upon, this Mechaber is based upon a Gemara in Shabbos, Adaf Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, and the Gemara is a little bit sussum. The Gemara doesn't say so much. The Gemara says, you shake out a garment, you're chayiv, but that's only if you're makpid. The Gemara doesn't discuss exactly what you are shaking out of the garment. That's a machlokes rishonim. Rashi says you're shaking dust out of the garment. Tosfos says no, you're shaking tal out of the garment. It seems to be that Tosfos held, how could it be, like Rashi, that you're shaking dust off the garment? Shaking dust off of a garment cannot be kibbutz. Kibbutz, laundering, is always done with a liquid. It's always done with water. We don't have kibbutz without any water, without anything else. So Tosfos learns that the Gemara is talking about, like the Mechaber says over here, it's talking about that the beged was wet. Now, when you shake out the garment from that wetness, it could be kibbutz. But now again, we need to explain what's up with all of these qualifiers. So the truth is that if you look in the Lavush, the way the Lavush explains this is the Lavush points out, he says, look, says the Lavush, almost the same lashon that we have over here in the Shulchan Aruch. The Lavush says, "Haminar talisay b'Shabbos mipnei tal she'olav." If somebody shakes out his beged on Shabbos to shake out the dew droplets that are on it, chayiv mishum kibbutz. This is a daraisa of kibbutz. V'davka b'chaditi, but this is only true if it's a new garment. V'uchmi, and it's a black garment. The bahanoch have a hanir yafeh k'moy kibbutz, because it's a nice, crisp, fresh garment and it's black. Over there, shaking out will be as accomplishing as laundering, right? When you have a nice, crisp, black garment, so black, everything shows up. It's nice and fresh and crisp. If you shake it out, you could shake everything off of it. So the Lavush is saying that the reason for these qualifiers is because that's when this act would be accomplishing something like kibbutz, only by a black, fresh garment. And says the Lavush, the next qualifier that the Mechaber said, V'hu shem makbid alav shaloi l'loiv shoi b'loi nir. And you're only chayiv if you're fussy, and you would be makbid to wear it as is without shaking it out. Now, says the Lavush, why is this? Why do you need these qualifiers? Like I said, if it's laundering, it's laundering. Why do I need these qualifiers? She'oz nikr demishum lelabnoi hu mina'aroi v'chayiv. If it's black and fresh and you're makbid, so then when you shake it out, what you're doing is you're laundering. Avalim chasar chad mehani, but if you're lacking any of these tanoim, if it's not a black fresh garment, or if you're not makbid, then mutter, then it's mutter. So, in other words, says the Lavush, the Mechaber gave us these two different qualifiers. Qualifier number one, it has to be black and fresh. Qualifier number two, you have to be a fussy individual. Says the Lavush very clearly, if you're missing either one of those, so let's say it's a old red garment, and you're a fussy guy. Doesn't matter. Since it's not black, whatever is on the garment is not so nicker. Whatever's on the garment doesn't show up so much. If it's an old white shirt, so then the dew that's on it isn't going to show up so much. So if you shake it out, you're not going to be accomplishing something like kibbutz. So you're fussy. You're doing it because you want to shake off whatever's on it. But it's still not elevated to an act of kibbutz because it's not accomplishing what kibbutz accomplishes. Or how about if it's a black new garment? So now shaking it out is going to accomplish something like kibbutz. But you're not a fussy guy. You would wear it the way it is. So then also it's going to be mutter. If you're missing either one of these qualifiers, says the Lavush, it's going to be mutter. Why? She'ein zeh, and this is the punchline, she'ein zeh kibbutz gamur la'oisroi b'chol inyan. The way the Lavush explains this Mechaber is he says you have to realize what we're dealing with over here. Shaking out a garment is not a maisa of laundering. When you think about laundering, you think about taking a garment, putting it in water, adding soap, agitating it, going, maybe squeezing it out, and soaking it, and wringing it. Those are all acts of kibbutz. Shaking out a garment, says the Lavush, is not an act of kibbutz. So she'ein zeh kibbutz gamer la'oisroi b'chol inyan. Shaking out a garment is not something that we could just aser because of kibbutz. Like I said earlier in this year, if it would be really an act of kibbutz, so then I don't care what color it is. I don't care if you're a fussy guy. I don't care if it's new or if it's old. If you're doing kibbutz, it's an Issa D'Oraisa on Shabbos. So what's happens over here? We care of what color it is and how new it is, and if you're fussy, if you're not fussy. Explains the Lavush, because what you're doing is essentially not kibbutz. Shaking out a garment is not an act of kibbutz. Eladoimel kibbutz. It's only something which is similar to kibbutz. Therefore, says the Lavush, that's why the Mechaber gives us these qualifiers. Because what the Mechaber is saying, the way the Mechaber is understanding the Gemara and the Rishonim, is that over here by shaking out a garment, we're dealing with something that is not really an act of kibbutz. The question is there a situation, are there circumstances under which shaking out a garment becomes elevated to an act of kibbutz? Says the Mechaber, yes. If you're dealing with a black, fresh, crisp garment, so that everything shows up on it, so then when you shake it out, you're really accomplishing cleaning off the garment. So it's accomplishing kibbutz. And if you're a fussy guy and you wouldn't wear that garment the way it is, and now by shaking it out, you're making it so that you will wear it, so you're accomplishing kibbutz, your kavana is for kibbutz, now shaking out the garment becomes an act of kibbutz, and now says the Mechaber, you're chayiv, it's an Issa D'Oraisa. This is the way the Lavush learns this Mechaber. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, and I think you're going to see that at first glance, you could say that the Mishnah Berurah is learning like the Lavush, but then it gets a little bit more complicated. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Aleph, Chadasha, First of all, the Mechaber said it has to be a new garment. So what does new mean? Does new mean you never wore it? Does new mean you wore it once? Does new mean a week? Does new mean a month? What does new mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'chadasha mikri, new garment is called im lo nishtamish ba'adayin harbe, as long as it was not yet heavily used. Sha'id nira b'chidushay, it still looks like a new garment. To me, like I keep on saying over here, it means a crisp garment. It's still a nice, new, crisp garment. And you can understand, I think, anybody who deals with clothing, you know the difference between a nice, fresh shirt, it's relatively new, right? It's very easy to get stuff off of the surface. You give it a good shake, it'll come off. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut and base, shechayra. The Mechaber said it has to be black. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and this is a very key Mishnah Berurah, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's got to be black. Aval chivre, but if it's white, v'sumke, or if it's red, less lanba, then this halach is not negeya. Why not? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tam, the reason is, the bechadasha ushchayra, when you're talking about a new garment that is black, minkar hayipoi al yedei hanir. Shaking it out is taka going to make it nicer. So what the Mishnah Berurah seems to be saying is, you know why it's got to be black and fresh? Because when it's black and fresh, shaking it out is effective. It's effective when you shake it out. Okay, again, like the Lavush said, this is not really an act of kibbutz. How are we elevating it to kibbutz? Well, if it's black and fresh, so the near shaking it out is effective, like kibbutz is effective. Since it's effective, we could start to look at it, and we could start calling it kibbutz. But, said the Mechaber, that alone is not enough. The fact that shaking out a black new garment is effective, and it accomplishes a significant level of kibbutz, that's not enough to elevate it to kibbutz daraisa and make it usher. What do you still need? Continues the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber said the other checkbox that you need to fill off is that you're a fussy guy. You're makbid and you wouldn't wear it the way it is. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why do you need that? Hatam, da'oz chashiva hanir k'may hakibus. If you're makbid, so then you're doing it for kibbutz. If you're a makbid guy, so you're shaking it out because it's effective, and you want to accomplish that act of kibbutz. So the oz chashiva hanir k'may kibbutz. Avol im ein darko lahakbid. But if you're not such a fussy guy, and sometimes you would be willing to wear the garment as it is without shaking it out, then it would be mutter to do this, even lechatchila. It would be mutter to do it. Because it's not really kibbutz. So it's not also. Oh, okay. Now, I told you that at first glance you could read this Mishnah Berurah, and it sounds very much like the way the Lavush learns. But here's the problem. The problem is that the Lavush that I read to you makes one thing very clear. The Lavush says that in order for this to be a Chiyuv Daraisa, there are 2, or maybe you want to call it 3, checkboxes that you need to be able to check off. 1, it's got to be a black garment. 2, it's got to be a fresh, crisp garment. 3, you have to be a fussy guy. Why do you need those 3 check boxes? Well, you need black and fresh, because in order to consider it kibbutz, it has to be effective. And niur is only going to be effective on a black, fresh garment. It's not going to be effective on a red garment, or a white garment, or a yellow garment. It's just not going to be effective. Why? We can understand it, because on black, everything shows up. So if you shake it off, the difference is going to be very clear. On white, on yellow, on red, everything doesn't show up the same way. So you don't make such a big difference by shaking it out. So, okay. So the Lavush tells me, checkbox number 1, you got to check off, it's black. Checkbox number 2, you got to check off, it's new. Why? Because that makes the kibbutz effective. Checkbox number 3, you got to be a fussy guy. Why do you got to be a fussy guy? Because if you're a fussy guy, then I understand that what you're doing is kibbutz, because you wouldn't wear it the way it is, so you want to clean it. So fine. So then it becomes a chiyuv daraisa. So one thing is very clear for the Lavush. If you're lacking any of these, if it's a red garment, I don't care how fussy you are. Right? That's very clear for the Levush. You need to check off all of these boxes. I mean, he said it straight, the Levush. He said, Avalun chosar chad mehani, if you're missing one of these conditions, mutter. Then it's mutter. And the logic flows very well. Problem is that from the Bir Halacha, it comes out that the Chavetz Chaim says not that way. The Chavetz Chaim seems to say that if you're dealing with a white garment or you're dealing with a red garment, so then if you're makbid, then it's chayiv. If you're not makbid, it's not chayiv. In other words, the way the Mishnah Berurah, at least based on what he says in the Bir Halacha, seems to be learning the mechaber is like this. If you're dealing with a fresh black garment, then we assume that you're makbid. So it's kind of like this. Haminar talis chadasha shchayra. If you shake off a new black garment, because the shaking out is going to be effective, and we assume that you're doing it because you're makbid. By a black new garment, if we see you shaking it out, you're chayiv. Why? Because the assumption is that the reason you're doing it is because you're makbid. Since it's effective and we see you doing it, why are you doing it? Because you want to do it. Why do you want to do it? Because you're a fussy guy. Then you're chayiv. If it's not a black new garment, then we can't assume that you're doing it because you're makbid. Then we have to know if you're makbid. If you have a white shirt and you want to shake it out and you want to know is it mutter or is it aser, you have to ask yourself, would I wear it the way it is? If the answer is no, that means you're makbid. Then you're not allowed to do it even by a white garment. So you hear the difference? By the Levush, it's very much in the nitty-gritty of the malacha. If it's not a black new garment, then the shaking it out cannot be kibbutz, according to the Levush, because it's not effective as kibbutz. So it cannot be kibbutz, and I don't care if you're makbid, and I don't care why you're doing it. Right? You can shake it out from now till the cows come home. You're not doing kibbutz, because it's not effective on a white old garment. It's only effective on a black new garment. Chavetz Chaim seems to say not that way. Chavetz Chaim seems to say that if you're a makbid guy and you want to shake out a white shirt in order to accomplish kibbutz, then that's also aser. So it's not that the vort of black and crisp is that's when it's effective and that's when it could be kibbutz. No, the vort of black and crisp is when we see you shaking out a black crisp garment, the assumption is that you're doing it in order to do kibbutz and you're doing it because you're makbid. But by a white shirt, we can't make that assumption. So, and the Aruch HaShulchan seems to learn the way I'm saying now as well. So this is, it's very complex. I'm trying to give you an overview of what's going on over here between the way the different people learn this, and now we're going to see more. I think we're going to see other indications in the Mishnah Berurah to come, where you're going to see how the Mishnah Berurah is kind of like walking this tightrope. Let's go weiter. Says the Ramah on the bottom line of Pehei Yom and Beis. So the Mechaber told us that if you take a new black garment and you're a fussy guy and you shake it out from what? From tal. Now tal is not very wet. Tal is only like droplets of moisture. Then you're chayiv. Says the Ramah Hago. V'chol shekain she'aser l'nair beged she'noshar b'mayim or she'yardu alav kshamim. Till now we were talking about a beged that only has droplets of dew on it. Says the Ramah, certainly if you want to take a soaking wet garment and you want to shake out a soaking wet garment, that's definitely aser. Then he puts in a little qualifier. But v'dafka bebeged chadash shemakbid alav. But that's only true if we're dealing with a relatively new garment, because you're makbid on it. An old garment, you're not makbid. Okay, what exactly is the kolshkein? So I told you at the beginning of the shir that there are really two different malachas that could potentially be at play over here. One is what we've been discussing till now, which is kibbutz, and the question of whether you're shaking out could be elevated to be an act of kibbutz. The other malacha is schita, squeezing out liquid from an absorbent fabric. Now, what the Ramah is saying over here is that if you're dealing with a beged that's soaking wet, now you've got a whole other malacha to deal with. Now you have the malacha of schita to deal with. When you take a soaking wet garment and you shake it out, you definitely extract water from it, right? Take a soaking wet towel and shake it out. What's going to happen? Water is going to go flying. Why? Because water that was absorbed in the towel is now being extracted from the towel. So says the Ramah, Kolshkein, we were talking until now about a beged that has droplets of dew. So okay, we're trying to figure out this is not an act of kibbutz. Could it become an act of kibbutz? You have to be makbid. It depends what kind of garment. Says the Ramah, you're dealing with a soaking wet garment. Now you've got a whole new problem. Now you've got a malacha of schita that you're dealing with. And this seems to be the way the Mishnah Berurah learns this. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Gimel Gishamim. Now here's where things again get interesting. Says the Chavetz Chaim, okay, upaseh, when we're dealing with a soaking wet garment, ein chilik beit shachar l'sha'ar tzavonim. Now we don't care anymore if it's black or if it's white or if it's red. Kamay b'tal le'el, like we did by dew. Dedavka shom shehu mu'it ein makbid l'nair ela b'uchmi. This is very interesting, right? Again, when we spoke about the lavush, we said that the difference between black and any other color is that by black, the near is effective. By other colors, the near is not effective. Now, the Mishnah Berurah seems to throw a little bit of a different spin on the difference between black and other colors. The Mishnah Berurah says now, when the Ramah says that you're not allowed to shake out a soaking wet garment, it doesn't matter what color it is. Why? Because over here, there's no difference between black and any other color, kamay b'tal le'el, like there is by tal. The dafka sham, it's only by tal, shehu mu'it. Tal, you're not dealing with a soaking wet beged. You're dealing with a beged with droplets of dew on it. Ein makbid l'na'er ela ba'uchmi. The only time that you would have a hakpada to shake out the garment from tal is by a black garment. Why? Because by a black, fresh, crisp garment, shaking it out will get the dew off, and it'll be nicker that the dew came off. By any other color, it's not going to be nicker, so you're not makbid to do it. Okay? And that's why it makes a difference what color it is. So you see what, again, from this Mishnah Berurah, the indication is that at the beginning of the Sif, when we said that there's a difference in the color, what's the difference in the color? The difference in the color is part and parcel of whether or not you're makbid to do it. If it's black, so then you're makbid to do it. So then you're doing it because you're makbid to do it. If it's red or it's yellow, it doesn't make sense to say that you're doing it because you are makbid. Why? Because it's not going to make such a difference anyway. So here the Mishnah Berurah sounds like the question of what color is hand in hand with the question of being makbid. But now, when the Ramah is talking about a soaking wet garment, haderech lahakbid l'nar b'chol ha'begadim. You always shake out a soaking wet beged. So we don't have to look at the color to decide whether or not you're makbid. When you have a soaking wet beged, yeah, you'll take it and you'll shake it out. I don't care what color it is. So you're definitely being makbid. By tal, if it's black, it makes sense that you're makbid. If it's white, it doesn't make sense that you are makbid. And now the Mishnah Berurah throws in a phrase at the end of the ice cotton, v'yesh bazeh mishum schita. And also, if it's soaking wet, there's a schita issue. Now, I mean, interestingly enough, one would think that the Mishnah Berurah could have said very simple. The Mishnah Berurah could have said, over here in the Ramah, when we're talking about a beged that's soaking wet because it got drenched in the rain, I don't care what color it is. You know why I don't care what color it is? Because over here I have a new problem. Over here I'm dealing with schita. When it comes to schita, I don't care what color it is. What's something gay or what color it is. When you shake it out, you're doing schita. So, again, the Mishnah Berurah is like walking tightropes over here. Okay. And then the Ramah said that v'dafka bebeged chadash shemakbid alav. This is only when the Ramah said that if it's soaking wet, you're zicha not allowed to do it, that's only by a new beged. Why, said the Ramah? Because by a new beged, you're makbid. Okay, Ritzayno Loimar. What the Ramah wants to say is, the mistamahu makbid alav lanar. By a new beged, yeah, you're going to be makbid to shake it out. Why? Lefisha miskatzer al yedei mayim. A new beged will shrink from the water, if you leave the water in it. So you want to shake it out. Vafilu beged yashan, even if it's old, says the Mishnah Berurah, tzarich lizar milanarim and amayim b'chayzik be'inyan sheyavel lidei schita ba'isei anir. Again, the Mishnah Berurah is dealing with a little bit of a problem over here. If what's driving the Ramah is schita, so I don't care what color it is. I also shouldn't care if it's new or if it's old. If it's schita, it's schita. What do I care? And that's why the Mishnah Berurah says now, even vafilu beged yashan, even if it's an old beged, tzarich lizar milanarim and amayim b'chayzik, you can't shake it out hard. If you're going to do schita. Everybody knows that when you shake out a wet beged hard, you're going to come to schita. So, again, the Ramah says, if the beged is drenched, right, kolshkein, that it's usher to shake it out, but only by a new beged. If the shaking it out is doing schita, I don't care if it's new or if it's old. Elamai, what the Ramah is saying is, you're not doing a hard shaking out. You're doing a more gentle shaking out that doesn't necessarily have to come to schita. And therefore, it's only a problem if it's a new beged, not if it's an old beged. Why is it a problem if it's a new beged? Oh, it's a problem if it's a new beged, because if it's a new beged, you're makpid to shake it out. Why are you makpid to shake out a new beged? Because a new beged, if it stays wet, it's going to shrink. And you don't want it to shrink. So you're makpid to shake it out. Okay, and now that I'm makpid to shake it out, sounds like now that I'm makpid to shake it out, it's becoming again a kibbutz problem. Not a schita problem. It's becoming a kibbutz problem. So again, what I think in totality, kind of, what we're seeing over here, the derech of the Mishnah Berurah in this sif seems to be, I hope I'm getting it right, but it seems to me to be that the way the Mishnah Berurah is playing this is that the problem that we're dealing over here is a kibbutz problem, both in the Mechaber and both in the Ramah. Notice, the Ramah didn't bite back on the Mechaber. The Mechaber didn't say a word about schita. The Mechaber only spoke about kibbutz. The Ramah didn't come along and in his words introduce schita. The only one who introduced schita to our discussion is the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah at the end of Eis Katan Gimel introduced schita. V'yesh bazeh mishum schita. But it doesn't sound like the conversation over here, the Mechaber and the Ramah, had anything to do with schita. The conversation over here has to do with kibbutz. And I think maybe we have to take a little bit from the Lavush, and a little bit from the Biur Halacha, a little bit from the Aruch HaShulchan, a little bit from the indications that we've seen here in the Mishnah Berurah, and we have to put together a derech that the Mishnah Berurah seems to be using, which is, I think, that we're dealing, like the Lavush said, with an act shaking out a beged, which is not by definition an act of kibbutz. The question is, does it become elevated to an act of kibbutz? It seems that the way the Mishnah Berurah is learning is that the ikar ingredient, the ikar variable, if you will, that would serve to elevate the shaking out of the beged to an act of kibbutz is das, what his kivun is. Why is he doing it? The kavana talya milsa. If you're doing it for kibbutz, then it could become elevated to become kibbutz. Now, how do we know what your kavana was? Well, the Mechaber says, if it's black and it's nice and fresh and crisp, then it makes sense to say that when you're shaking it out for kibbutz. Why? Because, well, when you shake out a new black garment from Tal, it's going to be effective. Not like the Lavush said, that it could only be kibbutz if it's effective, and it's only effective by a black, crisp garment. No, Mishnah Berurah is learning a little different. If it's black and if it's nice and fresh and crisp, then since shaking it out is effective, we're going to assume that your kivun is a kivun of kibbutz. And if your kivun is a kivun of kibbutz, then it's chayiv because it's elevated to kibbutz. Comes along the Ramah, and the Ramah says this question is only negaya when you're talking about a beged that's only a little bit wet from droplets of dew. But if we're dealing with a beged that's soaking wet, then we don't need black and new to tell us that your kivun is kibus. If it's a soaking wet garment, then everybody shakes out a soaking wet garment as an act of kibus. In other words, it's much easier now to say that the shaking out is an act of kibus. Why? Because everybody shakes out a soaking wet garment. So, memela, it's an act of kibus. Then says the Ramah, but that's only if it's new. Why? Because when you're dealing with a new garment, yes, everybody shakes it out. Why? Because they don't want it to shrink. So everybody shakes it out. But they do it because they don't want it to shrink. They don't want it to wash it. Yeah, but that's part of kibus. Part of kibus is shaking out a soaking wet garment. Grada, the reason they do it is because they don't want it to shrink. But it's an act of kibus on a soaking wet garment. So says the Ramah, when it's a soaking wet garment, I don't need to know the color. It's not negaya. If it's a soaking wet garment, you're going to shake it out. But only if it's new. An old garment, people don't rush to go shake it out. So therefore, by an old garment, you could shake it out because it's not automatically an act of kibus. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but even on an old garment, you can't shake it out hard. Because if you shake it out hard, that's when you have a new problem of schita. When you shake, and by schita, I don't care what your kivun is. You're extracting water from the garment. What do I care what your kivun is? This is the way I'm understanding. You see, you look at a page, Pevav Amud Aleph, and you say, wow, it's such a short little paragraph of Mishnah Berurah over here, right? But we didn't even do it all yet. And you see how complex this is. It's very, very complex. You have a lavush. You have an Aruch HaShulchan. You have over here a Beis Yosef on the Torah. There's a Bach. There's so many different indications in different ways, and there's a machlokes rishonim. Very complex. This is how I think the Mishnah Berurah is learning it over here. Okay, we're going to go a little bit weiter just to finish off the page. Says the Ramah at the end of the line over here, top only line of Pevav Amud Aleph. Yesh oimrim da'asal na'er beged min ha'avok sha'alav im makbid alav v'toiv lachush l'dvarav. Very important Ramah, negeh halacha l'maisa. And that is that there are those that say that it is usher to shake off a beged from the dust that's on it. And the Ramah says, v'toiv lachush l'dvarav, it would be good to be concerned for that shita. I think I still have the Gemara opened over here. If I have the Gemara opened here, yeah, I do. Just read to you from the Gemara that this is based on. You see, the Gemara says like this. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna said, Hamena'er talisai b'Shabbos, somebody who shakes out his garment on Shabbos, chayiv chatos, he's chayiv chatos. So this is a daraisa. V'loy amaron, but we only say this, ela b'chaditi, by a new garment. Alva ba'atiki, less lanba, but it's not again to an old garment. V'loy amaron, ela b'uchmi, and we only say this by a black garment. Alva b'chivri v'sumki, but if it's a white garment or a red garment, less lanba, not negeya. V'hu dekapen alayu, and it's only if you're fussy, and you're makbid that you wouldn't wear it the way it is. So that's the Gemara that this whole back and forth is based on. Now, if you notice, the Gemara didn't make mention of tal. The Gemara didn't make mention of geshem. The Gemara didn't make mention of avok, dust. The Gemara said you shake out your beged. Comes along machlokes rishonim. Says Rashi, hamina'er talisai. Somebody who shakes out his garment, zok Rashi min ha'afar, from dust. Says Tosfos, hamenar talisai, pirush Rabbeinu Chananel, menatal sha'olav, from dew, dahainu kibus v'libun, because when you shake out a garment that has moisture on it, that's when you can have a shaila of a chiv darais of laundering. That's when it could be kibus v'libun, chayv chatos. Then you could be chayv chatos. Says Tosfos, avo benir min afar, But you shake it out from dust, kidipirish bekuntris, like Rashi says, ain't nirish shaykh libun. How's that laundering? Laundering is always done with a liquid. Over here you have a dusty garment, you shake it out. How's that laundering? So, the beginning of Sif Aleph is going with Tosfos and the Rach, that the whole Shiloh over here is a Shiloh of Kibbutz. So we must be dealing with a wet garment. This Yesh Oimrim that the Ramah brings down, Yesh Oimrim Dasa Lanar Beged Mina Avak She'alav Makbid Olav. Again, you have to be Makbid. But there's a Yesh Oimrim that says that if you shake it off from the dust, that's Shitas Rashi. V'toiv lachush l'dvarav. And the Ramah says it would be good to be concerned for the opinion of Rashi. Let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Katan Hey, the Asalanar, who das Rashi v'siatoi. This is the opinion of Rashi and those who follow him. Desavri, the Hadar Mina B'Gamara, Amar Avuna, Menar Talisa B'Shabbos Chayv Katos, Dahainu Kishemenar Talisa Mina Avak V'Afar Sheniv Labai. It means shaking off the dust. V'Chayv Mishom Alabein, and that would be an Isser of Kibbutz. V'davka b'chaditi u'b'uchmi, but only by a new black garment. Ava ba'atiki, but an old garment, or b'chivri v'sumki, or a white garment, or a red garment, less lanba. It wouldn't be negeya, k'mavur sham, like the Gemara says over there. Why? Because when you shake off an old garment from the dust that's on it, it's not nicker. It doesn't make such a recognizable change. A fresh, crisp black garment does. V'hai denakat b'loshin iser, lashbina d'meina makbid, afilu iser or less lanba. But the Ramah is telling you that again, sedreitzach, whether or not you're makbid. If you're makbid, then all of these types of actions that are not primarily actions of kibbutz wouldn't be kibbutz. They're only kibbutz if you are makbid. Okay, we're going to continue on this theme, Mirz Hashem, tomorrow, and hopefully we'll get a chance to start discussing where does this come back to us. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan on Sky Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua's for us, Parnas, and Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be Zayich to see the B'yas Gal Tzedek. B'mherev Yabeinu. Amen. Be well.